SLT Mobitel. The connection.
මෙම විශේෂ සන්ලයිට් නිෂ්පාදන මිලදීගෙන ශ්‍රී ලාංකේය මනුදම්වියමන අපි සවිමත් කරමු. සන්ලයිට් කෙයා.
In your headlines tonight, no slap in the face. The parliament debate on the Port City bill heats up as the government tells the opposition to quit misleading the public.
And finally, we are left holding on to the illegitimate child. One member referred to the Supreme Court judgment as a slap in the face. There was no necessity for anyone to slap in the face.
Quick response. Sri Lanka's daily cases passed the 3,000 mark for the first time as China promises 500,000 Sinopharm doses before the month is up. The devil is in the details. US vaccine chief announces 20 million dose COVAX donation for allies and promises to avoid vaccine diplomacy in distribution plan.
Is that vaccines are tools for public health. We do not see them, do not intend to use them as means for influence or pressure, and our decisions will be made on the basis of need.
Kangaroo Court. The opposition takes up the case of Naufur Maulavi and Hijaz Hizbullah in Parliament and accuses the government of framing charges.
The case against Hijaz Hizbullah is totally fabricated.
All this and much more coming up on this Wednesday, the 19th of May 2021.
ඇල්කොහොල් අඩංගු hand sanitizer භාවිත කරන්න. ලෙඩ රෝග ඇති කරන විෂ බීජවලට එරෙහිව සටන් කරන්න. හඳුන්වා දීමේ මිල රුපියල් 350යි.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Good evening and welcome to First at 9. I am Shanella Fernando. In your top stories for tonight, Parliament today debated the controversial Port City bill after the Supreme Court ruling was presented to Parliament yesterday. Addressing Parliament, Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa assured that in line with the Supreme Court ruling, amendments will be included into the Port City bill in the second reading. The opposition, however, accused the government of convoluting a previous bill drafted by the previous regime.
අපරාජය නිරන්තරයෙන් ජනතාවට සමන් දෙන රජයක් ශ්‍රේෂ්ඨාධිකරණයට ගරු කරනවා. මේ පනත පිළිබඳ ශ්‍රේෂ්ඨාධිකරණ ලබා දී ඇති සියලුම උපදෙස් සහ නියෝග දෙවන කියවීමේදී ඉක්තු කිරීමට අපි බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා. ඒ සමගම අප සහෝදර පක්ෂ අදහස් වලටත් අහුම්කම් දෙමින් මේ පනත තවත් සංශෝධනයකට කිරීමට අපි බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා. කොමිෂන් සභාවේ සංයුක්ත බහුතරයක් ශ්‍රී ලාංකිකයන් විය යුතුයි යෝජනාව පනත ගැන තාවුරු කරන්නට අපි බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා. ඒ අතරම කොමිෂන් සභාවේ සභාපතිද ශ්‍රී ලාංකිකයෝ විය යුතු යන මතය පනත සමලින්ම සහවරු කරන්නට අපි බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා. මේ වරාය නගරේ බිහිවන රැකියා අවස්ථා වලින් 75%ක්වත් ශ්‍රී ලාංකිකයින්ට වෙන්විය යුතුයි. රෙගුලාසියද අපි ගෙනෙන්නට බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා.
ශ්‍රේෂ්ඨාධිකරණය කිව්වා මෙන්න මෙව්වා විවස්ථාවට අනුකූල නැහැ. පාර්ලිමේන්තුවේ අධීක්ෂණයෙන් එළියට මේක ගන්න බෑ. ඒකට අපි විරුද්ධ වුණා. මේ නියාමනය මහ බැංකුවෙන් එළියට අරගෙන SCC එකෙන් එළියට අරගෙන මේ කොමිසමට බාර දෙන එක. ඒ බලය මහ බැංකුවේ තියෙනවා. ඒවා පිළිගත්තා ශ්‍රේෂ්ඨාධිකරණය. මේකේ නඩු තීන්දුව එක තැනක තියෙනවා ගරු අගමැතිතුමා අප්‍රසන්නයි කියලා කිව්වා ශ්‍රේෂ්ඨාධිකරණය.
The Port City has tremendous potential and we need to ensure that Port City will be game-changing turning point in the history of our nation. It must be a place where people will come because it is efficient, because it gives a secure environment for investors. And that's why we have to do it in such a way that we can have an enabling law that will support that kind of activity. So the proposed law will be amended in accordance with what the Supreme Court has already stated. It will be operated by an efficient commission. 1 square meter of land there could be valued at around $2,500. And if so, the 69 hectares that Sri Lanka would enjoy with complete rights, that itself could yield us $1,725 million, $15 billion worth worth of investments in the next 5 years, 200,000 jobs and livelihoods opportunities during the construction stage, 83,000 USD based jobs in 5 years, and it would add approximately $4.5 billion to the GDP of our country in the first few years, and thereafter at the rate of around $12 billion of additional GDP to our country.
The Port City project was like an unwanted pregnancy. Initially, our government said we will terminate this unwanted pregnancy. They went for abortion. Then what happened? Doctors said it was too late to do the abortion. If you did the abortion, mother's life will be at risk. Sri Lanka was caught in a debt trap, therefore we couldn't afford to abort this. And finally, we are left holding on to the illegitimate child. Now, having come back to power, you have now realized you have to do something about this issue. Then we offer the Indians the Eastern Terminal. There were agitation instigated by the Sri Lanka Ports Authority unions and the Buddhist clergy and various organizations. Who could have instigated those protests is anybody's guess. This draft bill that was prepared, Honorable Harsha De Silva's committee, was finally accepted by the Prime Minister, and he appointed another committee, and they virtually adopted the draft we prepared. Now somebody at the President's Secretariat has totally changed it upside down, and that is why you had to face this situation in the Supreme Court. Now you are saying, okay, we will now accept all what the Supreme Court says and amend it. But then, even with the amendments, this is total convolution of the original bill. Nobody is going to come and invest the state in which this bill is.
One member referred to the Supreme Court judgment as a slap in the face. There was no necessity for anyone to slap in the face. Whatever amendments that are suggested were suggested by us, by the government, to the Supreme Court, and we gave an assurance there itself that we will incorporate them into the Act after the Cabinet approves. This particular project has been now approved by the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in its approval, they try to show that there are 26 places. Don't try to mislead the public, as you have been misleading right from the beginning.
කාලගුණය කොහොමුණත් රයිනෝ නං වහලට සේෆ් තමයි මුළු ගෙදරම.
Meanwhile, Venerable Alle Gunawansathera and Archbishop of Colombo, His Eminence Malcolm Cardinal Ranjith, have requested the government to hold back from passing the Colombo Port City Economic Commission Bill tomorrow and engage with and consider the views of all stakeholders. The request was made at a special press conference held at the Colombo 7 Dharma Institute this afternoon.
අපිට ප්‍රශ්නයක් තියෙනවා ඇයි මේ තරම් ඉක්මනට කලබලෙන් මෙවැනි පනතක් සම්මත කරගන්න හදන්නේ කියලා. කලින් රජය කිව්වේ කිසිම ගැටලුවක් නැහැ ඊටාම හොඳ වැඩපිළිවෙලක් තමයි අපි ඉදිරිපත් කරලා තියෙන්නේ කියලා. එසේනම් ශ්‍රේෂ්ඨාධිකරණය මේ සංශෝධන 25ක් ඉදිරිපත් කරන්නේ මොකද? අපි කියනවා ද්විත්ව පුරවැසියන් මේකට පත් නොකළ යුතුයි. ශ්‍රී ලාංකිකයින්ට මේ කමිටු වලට බඳවා ගත යුතුයි කියන දැඩි තීරණයක අපි සිටින ආණ්ඩුක්‍රම ව්‍යවස්ථාවට නැති ප්‍රශ්න තොගයක් අපට තියෙනවා. ඒ නිසා අපට ඒව රජයත් සමග කතා කරගත යුතු තිබෙනවා.
මේක අවුරුදු ගානකට කලින් හිටපු ආණ්ඩුව හම්බන්තොට වරාය පිළිබඳව සම්මුතියකට ගිය වෙලාවේදී මේ දැන් රජය කරන ආණ්ඩු පක්ෂයේ ඈයොම ඒකට විරුද්ධව තදින් කටයුතු කරා. මේ කටයුත්තේදී ඊටත් වඩා කලබලයකින් මේ කරන්න යන වැඩපිළිවෙල පිළිබඳව ජනතාව වෙනුවෙන් ලොකු ප්‍රශ්නයක් අපිට මතුවෙනවා. එනිසා අපි රජයෙන් ඉල්ලා සිටිනවා කරුණා කරලා පුළුල් කතිකාවතක් ඇති කරලා සෑම දිනාගේම අදහස් සුදහස් විමසලා මෙම පනත ඉදිරිපත් කරන්නට කටයුතු කරන්න කියලා.
Speaking in Parliament today, Minister of Public Security, retired Rear Admiral Dr. Sarath Veerasekara brushed aside opposition claims that Naufur Maulavi was an excuse by the government to stop the search for the real mastermind of the Easter attacks, revealing that the FBI too came to the same conclusion as Sri Lanka's own investigators. Meanwhile, Samagi Jana Balawege parliamentarian Rauf Hakim accused the government of fabricating evidence against attorney Ijaz Hizbullah, cautioning that such actions will cost the government its credibility. The subject of investigations into identifying the mastermind behind the Easter Sunday attacks was taken up in Parliament today, with Minister of Public Security Rear Admiral Dr. Sarath Veerasekara outlining the probes carried out between the Attorney General's Department and the police. In response to opposition claims that suspect Naufur Maulavi, who investigators identified as the brains behind the attacks, was not the mastermind, the minister rubbished the allegations by revealing that such a conclusion had also been arrived at by the US Federal Bureau of Investigation as well.
පොලිසිය විසින් ගිය වසරේ නොවැම්බර් මාස පාස්කු පහර සිද්ධි 8ක් සම්බන්ධයෙන් උද්දෘත ගොනු 8ක් නීතිපතිවරයාට අපි ලබා දුන්නා. ජනාධිපති කොමිසම් වාර්තාව නීතිපතිවරයාට මේ වසරේ පෙබරවාරි මාස ලබා දුන්නා. ඉන්පසු 2021 මාර්තු මාස 12 වෙනි දින සිට අප්‍රේල් 24 දක්වා පොලිස් විමර්ශන නිලධාරීන් 54 දෙනෙක් නීතිපති දෙපාර්තමේන්තුවේ නීතිඥ කණ්ඩායමක් සමග ජ්‍යෙෂ්ඨ නියෝජ්‍ය සොලිසිටර් ජෙනරාල් වරියකගේ ප්‍රධානත්වයෙන් මෙම සාක්ෂි සහ කරුණු ගැඹුරින් අධ්‍යයනය කළා. එසේ අධ්‍යයනය කරන අතරතුර යම් අඩුපාඩු මතුවෙනවා. මේ අඩුපාඩු සහිත සාක්ෂි සම්පින්ඩන වාර්තාවක් අප්‍රේල් මාස 24 වෙනි දින පොලිසියට බාර දුන්නා. පොලිසිය ඒ අඩුපාඩු බොහෝ කොටසක් සම්පූර්ණ කොට නීතිපති දෙපාර්තමේන්තුවට යවා අවසන්. ඉතිරි අඩුපාඩු ඉදිරි කාලය තුලදී යවීමට බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා.
The case against Hijaz Hizbullah is totally fabricated. You have filed a case because of different reasons, because he was politically opposed to you or for whatever reason. But there have been evidence to show that small children have been forced to give statements against him. There is evidence and affidavit for that from the parents and others. Please look into this, because by these false allegations and false cases, credibility of the government and the effort to find the real culprits behind this will be lost.
Hijaz Hizbullah Save the Pearl කියන එක තමයි ඇති කළේ. ඒ සංවිධානයේ නවුෆර් මෞලවි සහ සහරාන් කියන අය දේශන පවත්වලා තියෙනවා. අපි නවුෆර් මෞලවි ගැන යමක් කිව යුතුයි. පොලිස් පරීක්ෂණ අනුවත් ඇමරිකානු විමර්ශන අනුවත් මෙම ප්‍රහාරයේ මහමලුකරු භූමිකාව නවුෆර් මෞලවි විසින් රංගපා ඇති බව පැහැදිලි වෙනවා. ඔහු තමයි IS මතවාදයේ ලංකාවට ගෙනවිත් 2016 දී සහරාන්ව මේ මතවාදයට යොමු කළේ. ඒක සහරාන්ගේ බිරිඳ සාදියාගෙනුත් සනාථ වෙනවා. ඔහු තමයි IS පුහුණු පාඨමාලාව සම්පූර්ණයෙන්ම ගෙන ගියේ. නුවරඑළිය සහ හම්බන්තොට පුහුණු කඳවුරු අධීක්ෂණය කළේ නවුෆර් මෞලවි. නවුෆර් තමාගේ බිරිඳගේ නංගියව සහරාන්ට විවාහ කර දුන්නා. නවුෆර් සහරාන්ගේ ජ්‍යෙෂ්ඨයා හැටියට කටයුතු කළා. නවුෆර් මෙම ප්‍රහාරයේ ප්‍රධාන චරිතය බව FBI එකනුත් සනාථවට තිබෙනවා. මේ ප්‍රහාරයට විදේශිකයන්ද සම්බන්ධයි. ශ්‍රී ලාංකික සම්භවයක් තියෙන ඕස්ට්‍රේලියානු ජාතික ලුක්මාන් තාලි කටාරිති අත්අඩංගුවටගෙන තිබෙනවා. ලුක්මාන්ගේ අල් කයිඩා සහ IS මතවාදීන් සමග සම්බන්ධකම් සොයාගෙන තිබෙනවා. මාලදිවයින් ජාතික සැකකරුවන් 4ක් අප සොයාගෙන සිටිනවා. ඔවුන් තමයි ජමාතේ ඉස්ලාම් සිං ශිෂ්‍ය සංවිධානයේ සාදික් අබ්දුල්ලාට මුදල් ලබා දුන්නේ සහ ආයුධ හදන්නට ලේත් මැචුමක් ලබා දුන්නේ.
For the first time since the COVID-19 outbreak emerged in Sri Lanka, the country's daily COVID-19 infections surged past the 3,000 mark today. Meanwhile, health experts have urged all vaccinated Sri Lankans to continue to follow precautions, as they could still infect their loved ones before achieving the required immune response after a specific period of time. In the meantime, in a further boost to the country's vaccination program, State Minister of Production, Supply and Regulation of Pharmaceuticals, Professor Channa Jayasumana, announced today that Sri Lanka will receive 500,000 doses of the Sinopharm vaccine as a donation from China before the end of this month.
Sri Lanka crossed 3,000 daily COVID-19 cases for the first time today. With that, the total number of cases for the day so far stands at 3,591. Meanwhile, during the course of yesterday, 2,518 infections were confirmed in the island. 40 of the new cases were reported as imported cases, while the remaining 2,478 came from 23 districts. The highest number this time around came from the Kalutara district with 391. In addition, the Gampa and Colombo districts came in second and third respectively with 350 and 333 cases, showing a continuing high risk in the western province. Further, 179 infections were reported from Anuradhapura, 170 from Kegol, 144 from Jaffna, 113 from Kurunegala, 108 from Goal, 89 from Kandy and 72 from Nuwara-Eliya. The remaining 529 infections came from 13 other districts. In the meantime, experts once again cautioned the public to take care in spaces with inadequate ventilation, as the virus can remain in circulation for a longer time than open ventilated spaces.
If there are people close to you, you get infected from these tiny droplets which are deposited about 1 meter away. So it is important to keep that distance so that the droplets don't propel for more than 1 meter. But sometimes in a very closed environment, it can be a closed room, a AC room where there is no ventilation. These droplet particles can be in the air for some time. And somebody comes into that room, the person can get infected. But if this happens outdoors, or if the room is open, the doors and windows are open, then the room is very properly ventilated, and in such instances, this doesn't happen.
Meanwhile, the total number of COVID-19 fatalities in the island surged past 1,000 today to stand at 1,015 after 34 COVID-19 deaths were reported yesterday. Meanwhile, the total number of recoveries in the island stood at 122,367 today after 1,222 patients were discharged from treatment centres. As of now, the country's active cases stands at 30,980. On the vaccination front, as of last evening, 925,242 people were administered with the first dose of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, while 297,686 of them have completed their vaccinations. Meanwhile, 457,840 people have received their first Sinopharm doses, while 2,435 have been completely vaccinated. Further, 14,917 people have received the Sputnik V jabs as of last evening. With that, however, health experts have cautioned the public to continue to follow health and safety protocols, even if they are fully vaccinated, as they say people will still not be fully safe from infection.
දැන් කිසිම එන්නතක් ගහලා පහුවෙන්දට ආරක්ෂාව ලැබෙන්නේ නැහැ. මොකද ඒකට ප්‍රතිශක්තිකරණ පද්ධතිය දියුණු වෙලා ඒක රෝග වළක්වන්න කාලයක් යනවා. කොවිෂීල්ඩ් එන්නතක් එක ඩෝසයක් ගහලා සාමාන්‍යයෙන් දවස් 21ක් විතර යනවා රෝගයෙන් ආරක්ෂා වීමට. ඒත් එක ඩෝස් එකකින් ඒක මදි වෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඒකයි ඩෝසස් දෙකක් තියෙන්නේ. දැන් සයිනෝෆාර්ම් වගේ එන්නතකින් දෙවනි මාත්‍රාව ලබාගෙන ඒක ගැන සති දෙකක් විතර ගියාට පස්සේ තමයි හොඳ ප්‍රතිශක්තිකරණයක් එන්නේ.
එන්නත ලබාගත් කෙනෙකුටත් රෝගය වැළඳීම ඉඩකඩ තියෙනවා. හැබැයි ඒ වැළඳුනාට රෝගය අසාධ්‍ය වීම ඉඩකඩ අඩුයි. ඒ නිසා අපි මතක තියාගන්න ඕන මට රෝගය වැළඳුනොත් මම ඒ රෝගය ගෙදර ගෙනියන්න පුළුවන්. නැත්නම් මගේ ඔෆිස් එකේ වැඩ කරන අයට, වෙන තැනක වැඩ කරන අයට, මාත් එක්ක කතා බහ කරන අයට මේ රෝගය මගෙන් පැතිරෙන්න ඉඩ තියෙනවා.
Meanwhile, health experts have also warned people vaccinated with the first dose of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine not to mislead health staff and have the Sinopharm vaccine administered as a second dose, as the government already has plans in the pipeline to secure sufficient second doses.
ජනතාවගෙන් ඉල්ලා සිටිනවා ඔබ ඇස්ට්‍රාසෙනිකා එන්නත පළවෙනි මාත්‍රාව ලෙස ලබාගෙන සිටින කෙනෙක් නම් මේ වෙනකොට ලබා දෙන සයිනෝෆාර්ම් එන්නත ගිහිල්ලා ලබා ගන්න එපා කියලා. මොකද එය සෞඛ්‍ය අමාත්‍යාංශයේ විසින් නිර්දේශ නොකරන දෙයක්. අපිට ඇතැම් තැන්වලින් වාර්තා වෙලා තියෙනවා මෙවැනි සිද්ධීන්.
What's more, experts have also urged patients who have previously contracted COVID-19 and recovered to get themselves vaccinated without fear.
කොවිඩ් රෝගයෙන් පෙළුණ කෙනෙක් නම් එහිදී එන්නත ලබා නොසිටීම සිදු නොකළ යුතුයි. ඔබ කොවිඩ් රෝගය ඔබට වැළඳුණත් ඔබ ඊට පස්සේ එන්නත ලබා ගැනීම සිදු කළ යුතුයි. එහිදී එන්නත ලබා ගැනීමෙන් මගින් ඔබගේ ඒ ප්‍රතිශක්තිය වැඩිවීමක් සිද්ධ වෙනවා.
Meanwhile, in good news, State Minister of Production, Supply and Regulation of Pharmaceuticals, Professor Channajay Sumana, announced that Sri Lanka will receive 500,000 doses of the Sinopharm vaccine as a donation from China before the end of this month. In the meantime, UNICEF, with the support of the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, has procured and delivered a consignment of oxygen concentrators and other vital equipment to the Ministry of Health in support of Sri Lanka's ongoing response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The items include 291 oxygen cylinders, 342 oxygen regulators, 2,490 masks for adults and children, and 20 fire extinguishers.
At a teleconference held today, the U.S. coordinator of its global COVID-19 response and health security at the State Department, Gail E. Smith, announced a donation of 20 million vaccine doses to the COVAX facility from the U.S. stockpiled. She added, however, that so far no plans have been drafted on the specific distribution process, time frame and priority list of countries that will be targeted, and promised that the process will not be tainted with arm twisting to gain influence. Smith also stated that a further 60 million Oxford AstraZeneca doses pledged by US President earlier will only be released once the Food and Drug Administration issues a safety clearance for use.
We will be sharing 20 million vaccine doses from our own stock, in addition to the 60 million AstraZeneca doses that were announced previously by the President. So that means we're going to be putting 80 million additional vaccines into the mix, making us the largest sharer of vaccines thus far. We intend, in leading this effort, to work closely with allies. The way we're looking at this is to look at, again, every region, and I think the facts are that every region in the world is facing constraints. We're looking at need, other supplies. We're looking at how we can get maximum coverage. We're consulting closely with COVAX, and that is focused on, in particular, low-income and low-middle-income countries, and with our partners, in order to initiate a process where we start to get the global coverage we need. The time period that was referenced has to do with the need to actually have those vaccines in hand, figure out the distribution, but also because on the AstraZeneca 60 million doses, we need FDA clearance before those move in order to ensure that they are fully safe. I can't tell you at this point what the allocation is going to be per country. We will have information for you later on, and as I think I mentioned, we are also, with respect to India and also India's neighbors, mounting an emergency humanitarian response given the surges that are ongoing there. Is that vaccines are tools for public health. They are the means for bringing this pandemic to an end. We do not see them, do not intend to use them as means for influence or pressure, and our decisions will be made on the basis of need, public health data, and again, collaboration with key partners, absolutely including COVAX.
The Civil Aviation Authority announced today that all passenger arrivals into the country will be suspended until the 31st of May, starting from midnight on the 21st of May. In the meantime, police operations are continuing to arrest people violating the identity card number system, with 99 arrested just yesterday alone.
With the rapid surge of COVID-19 infections in the country, the chairman of the Civil Aviation Authority, Upul Dhamradasa, announced that all passenger arrivals will be suspended from midnight on the 21st of May. Accordingly, the restrictions will continue in place until the 31st of May. In the meantime, taking the country's pandemic situation into account, the head office of the Department of Immigration and Emigration, as well as all of its regional offices, have been closed until further notice. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Agriculture announced today that all economic centres across the country will remain closed throughout the island-wide travel restrictions from Friday until the 24th of this month. However, all economic centres, including the Manning Market in Paliagoda, will reopen for business from 4 a.m. to 11 p.m. on the 25th, when people are allowed to venture out once again. The centres will close once again on the 26th until the 28th of May, when travel restrictions come back into effect next week. Meanwhile, police operations continued in public spaces to deter attempts by members of the public to venture out by misusing the NIC number system.
340 persons have been arrested in connection with the offences of face mask and social distancing. In addition to that, the violation of quarantine rules and regulations. In addition to that, another operation has been conducted at the exit and entry point of Western Province. 4,942 persons have been checked, along with 2,568 vehicles. 215 persons have been sent back to their original places as they were trying to cross the provincial border in violating the quarantine guidelines, rules and regulations. In addition to that, another operation has been conducted from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. in the evening in Western Province. 9,793 persons have been checked by the police, especially to check whether they have followed ID card number system, and 99 persons have been arrested in connection with the quarantine rules and regulations, especially the persons who have violated ID card number system.
With 12 years having passed since the end of the war against terrorism, a national ceremony was held this evening to pay tribute to the country's fallen heroes under the patronage of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. The ceremony was held at the National War Heroes Monument in Battaramulla.
The national ceremony commemorating the country's war heroes took place today in line with the 12th anniversary of the war victory against the LTT at the National War Heroes Monument in Battaramulla this evening. The former commanders of the Tri-Forces during the war, Marshal of the Air Force Roshan Gunatilaka and Admiral of the Fleet Vasantha Karannagoda arrived first at the premises. Afterwards, Chief of Defence Staff as well as Commander of the Sri Lanka Army General Shavendra Silva, Commander of the Air Force Air Marshal Sudarshana Patirana, Commander of the Navy Vice Admiral Nishantha Uligetanna and Defence Secretary Retired General Kamal Gunaratne also graced the occasion. Afterwards, former President Maithripala Sirisena, Speaker Mahinda Yapa Abeyewardena and Opposition Leader Sajith Premadasa also arrived at the premises. After this, Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was the Commander-in-Chief during the war, made his presence as well. Finally, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa arrived at the premises and he was welcomed by Defence Secretary Retired General Kamal Gunaratne.
The arrival of His Excellency the President of...
During the event, the head of state paid floral tributes to the brave Triforces personnel who sacrificed their lives to end the 30-year-old war.
For his bravery in the battle...
Japan has withdrawn a controversial immigration bill that sought to ease the way for its government to deport immigrants and asylum seekers who have exhausted all appeals. The decision came after intense public and international opposition to the bill after the heartbreaking death of a Sri Lankan woman who was held in detention for 7 months. Her death sparked public protest over Japan's supposed apathetic approach to immigrants after it was revealed that authorities ignored her appeals for medical care. In March this year, a 33-year-old Sri Lankan woman died at an immigration detention center in Nagoya, Japan, after being held for 7 months for overstaying her student visa. The victim, VISHMA SANDAMALI, a resident of Imbulgoda, Gampaha, reportedly died of emaciation after a continued deterioration in her health. The victim had been unable to eat or walk during her time in custody and had alleged that her pleas for medical care had fallen on deaf ears even after she lost 20 kilograms in weight. Meanwhile, a public outcry over the Japanese government's harsh immigration laws that allow for indefinite detention of people who have overstayed their visas has thrown the spanners in its plans to introduce a new immigration bill that would have made it easier to deport immigrants whose refugee applications have failed. As the Japanese government tries to pass the bill in its current parliament sessions, opposition parties have called for it to be abolished. The bill also came in for criticism from the United Nations Human Rights Council, which pointed out that it does not in any way meet international criteria for human rights protection. However, signaling a victory for opponents of the bill, the Japanese government announced yesterday that the bill is to be withdrawn, following the intense criticism and public protests in the past weeks. However, the need to provide justice to VISHMA SANDAMALI's family remains, as immigrant support groups continue to criticize the Japanese government's inability to provide a proper explanation of the circumstances behind her death. She was the 18th foreigner to die in Japanese immigration custody since 2007. The external sector performance for the month of March witnessed somewhat of a mixed bag of ups and downs, with remittances and tourism showing some improvement, while the deficit in the trade deficit showed some widening for the first time since April last year.
Sri Lanka's external sector displayed mixed performance in March 2021, with a widened trade deficit as well as healthy growth in workers' remittances, along with a slight pickup in the tourism sector. Further, the deficit in the trade account widened in March 2021 for the first time since April 2020. Meanwhile, both exports and imports were significantly higher in March 2021 compared to March 2020 as well as February 2021. However, workers' remittances grew steadily and the tourism sector continued its recovery process, albeit at a very slow pace. In the financial account, both foreign investment in the government securities market and the Colombo Stock Exchange continued to record marginal net outflows in March 2021. In the meantime, the Sri Lankan rupee depreciated against the US dollar during the month, partly reflecting the seasonal demand for imports. However, supported by regulatory measures that were in place till mid-March, the central bank absorbed foreign exchange on a net basis during the month to strengthen the gross official reserve position. Meanwhile, in March 2021, the central bank entered into a bilateral currency swap arrangement with the People's Bank of China for 10 billion Chinese yuan, approximately $1.5 billion, with a view to promoting bilateral trade and direct investment for economic development of the two countries.
With that, we wrap up tonight's edition of First at 9. Thank you for joining. Have a good night.